Well, welcome everybody. This is the online version of an event we ran a week or so ago on evidence-based HR, and it's our second piece of research around evidence. In fact, it's our third if you go back a bit further, but it's our second recent piece of research on evidence-based HR, which I think reflects the importance we and others put on it and the interest that we're getting in it. So, and a good turnout today again shows that there is a good interest in this subject. You hear evidence-based as a prefix to lots of other things, not just HR, but all sorts of practice talking about evidence-based approaches, and why wouldn't you? Conscious that not everyone on the line knows everything about CRF, so I was just going to ask Mel just to introduce a little bit of background on CRF for those who are less familiar. Mel.
Yeah, thanks, John, and hi everyone. And I can see some familiar faces, so I know that for some of you, I apologise. This is going to be familiar words about who we are. On the next slide, Rob, we just have something for you to look at whilst I'm talking. The one after that, I think. Essentially, what we're all about is building HR capability for your team. So we specialise in HR research, insight, outside-in thinking. What are other organizations doing that you can learn from? What are you all doing that you can learn from? Sharing wisdom with each other, and just helping you to find those fresh perspectives on some of the topics that we think are absolutely crucial. So this is a great example of one of our online events. We also run these in person, as John mentioned. We produce, which I'm hoping you've all seen, research reports on key topics in HR, tools, frameworks, videos, lots for your team to digest. We have digital communities as well on topics like HR business partnering, talent, D&I, HR directors, and being effective in that role. And there's lots of ways to ensure that you are staying ahead of the curve as an HR team and that you have the capability to succeed. So that's what we're all about. And on the next slide, if I think about what we're doing next year, so as John said, this piece of research on evidence-based HR is really core to the DNA of CRF. We want to provide you with the evidence you need as an HR team to make those key decisions. So on the next slide, Rob, there's an agenda of some of the things we've got coming up.
It's not responding. 1 second. It's just
okay. Well, I can talk through. There's a few key themes that we think are going to be affecting HR teams. So I'm sure none of these are coming as shocks or surprises to you. And we'll be taking, of course, an evidence-based approach to all of these topics. And we'll be looking at technology, utilising technology, emerging technologies for business and for HR. We'll be looking at reskilling the organisation. I mean, technology, of course, being a huge reason to reskill, but not the only one. We'll be looking at leadership capability and development, especially for some of the new skills needed for that population. We'll be looking at employee well-being and sustainable well-being. And really, that's one of the key topics that I think will be really interesting to do from an evidence-based approach. And then we'll be talking about organisational performance as well. So lots to learn from, lots to get involved in. We'll be delivering that across the Gulf and Europe. So I hope to see you all there. Let me know if anybody is interested in learning more after the webinar.
Brilliant, thanks Mel. Well, we've only got sort of what's left of an hour together, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to hand over to Rob, who's going to walk us through the research and its application. See the sort of broad agenda on that slide there. The only thing I'll say is we've got time for questions at the end, but as we go through, if there's something you're not clear about or some observation you want to make, please post it in chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat and we'll interrupt Rob with those sort of questions as we go through, if you have them. Otherwise, we'll have some questions at the end. Thank you, and over to Rob.
Great, thanks John, thanks Mel. So yes, I'm going to give a quick overview of the evidence-based HR, a new paradigm report. I would urge you to go and look at it. There's a lot more details, a lot more material in there, which will guide you through some of the stuff I'm doing. It's just to give you a feel of it today. So I want to first talk about a research summary, We did some research into this, and I want to talk about what we found. Then I'll be talking about the new model and talk about why it's a bit different from previous ones and how you use it practically. And I'll conclude with talking about some next steps, things you can do next if you want to try and pursue and become more evidence-based in your own practice. So firstly, there's a fundamental challenge, I think, in any professional field, and it's worth standing back a bit. Any professional at all is faced with almost the same issues or challenges. Firstly, what is the most important things or issues or problems or opportunities faced by our clients? And secondly, once we discover those, which interventions are most likely to resolve or help with those issues? And broadly speaking, the more accurate our understanding, the more effective we will be. And in fact, evidence-based practice has been used across quite a lot of fields, from things like policy making to policing to medicine and to architecture. They all face exactly the same questions. So it also, of course, applies to HR in particular. There have been historical concerns about the added value of HR, which continue, fairly or not. And the question people often ask, and what we at CRF are committed to trying to do, is to help HR get better at helping the business. How can we do it? We can do it, I think, by improving our understanding of the business issues we face, and also by identifying those solutions that are most likely to resolve those issues. And I think one important thing for me, which is pretty important, is I feel that there is now widespread acceptance throughout the profession that we can and we need to make better use of data and evidence to increase our effectiveness. And that is a relatively new thing, I think. So this is a rough history of where we've got to, I guess, with evidence-based HR. On the top left, you can see what, as far as I understand it, is the first ever publication written about evidence-based HR. And as we go over the past 24 years, we can see there's been various interests from places like IES, from KPMG. 2011, as John mentioned, CRF produced one of the earliest reports into this. HR Magazine, a book came out about evidence-based management in general. CIPD did courses as now professional doctorate in Birkbeck, University of London, and our last report came out a couple of weeks ago. So there has been a change, there's been a progression, and people have deepened their understanding of what evidence-based HR means and how you actually do it in practice. So I think one way to think about evidence-based HR throughout this presentation, if you're reading the report, is it's a process that delivers more informed and more accurate answers to two fundamental questions. First, which are the most important problem opportunities faced in the organization? What is going on? What's most important? Second, which solutions or interventions are most likely to help? And to put this very simply, what's going on and what can we do about it? Those questions are best answered through a combination of using the best available evidence and critical thinking. And there's three basic principles to evidence-based practice in any field, including HR. Principle one, incorporate multiple sources and types of evidence. Principle two, adopt a structured and explicit approach of gathering and using that evidence. And principle three, focus on the most trustworthy and relevant evidence. So they are the basic principles of evidence-based HR. So the research, what did we do? We did a survey of around 200 members and others of CRF. We also interviewed 20 senior HR people who've in different ways tried to implement and use evidence-based HR in their own function. So I'm going to talk about the survey a bit first. So the first question at the top left is, to what extent is the HR profession in general evidence-based? And what we did in the survey, some of you may have completed it, is we asked people to answer the question before we gave them a definition and after we gave the definition. But if you like, ignore that just for now, just go for the top figure. So we can see that on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 not at all, 10 as evidence-based as you can be, respondents to our survey put HR between 4 and 5. So to me, this is really important because I tend to agree with that, but without acknowledging that's the case, I think there won't be any desire to try and get better at using more data and evidence. Below that, we see how well has any training provided the knowledge and skills required to practice evidence-based management. And again, they're kind of a bit in the middle, again, suggesting that people are aware there's this room for improvement. And indeed, at CRF, that's something we're doing, is to actually provide training and other tools to help you get better at doing it. And then we also asked people about their own HR function. Of course, not surprisingly, they said in the top right there, they feel their own HR function is a little more evidence-based than HR in general, but surprisingly not that much more, so just a little bit. And again, people also reported maybe have a limited level of understanding and maybe only sometimes make explicit use of the best available evidence. So this survey, there's lots more findings in the report, but it suggests there is an awareness there is an issue to be addressed for the profession, and there's awareness that, you know, there maybe are ways of doing it. So we asked people what might help them do it.
Rob, can I just interrupt for a second? Question
Please.
from you, and I know you've looked at some other professional practices.
Yeah.
How would HR stack up against a kind of a range of professions and how they use evidence?
That's a great question from you. Thanks very much. Perfect. So you mean if you ask the same questions, I guess. So I don't have the answer to that. So I'm not sure, but I'm guessing in some professions, such as possibly architecture, engineering, even someone saying policy making, they probably rate themselves as slightly higher for one simple difference. It doesn't mean they are, but because a lot of those professions have been trained in evidence-based practice. So they'll be aware of what it is. They're probably more likely to do it in their jobs. It doesn't mean HR is necessarily good or bad. And it's a good question because you would have to really look in detail at the behaviors. And indeed, CRF is already also developing an audit tool to allow people to look at the behaviors of their team around evidence-based HR, which will give you more kind of precise answers. So I think a fair comparison could be other professions, Ewan, but I think another comparison is how do we compare with marketing? How do we compare with operations? How do we compare with finance? And I think if you look at those areas, you can probably have your own views about how we'll compare to those. But it's a great question and one that I think we haven't looked at properly. I mean, not just this research, but more broadly. So thank you for that. We also asked people what they thought would facilitate, what would help. And I found this particularly interesting, that the number one thing that the respondents said they thought would help was the organizational leaders placing a greater value on an evidence-based approach. And for anybody here who is in a leadership role, I think this is kind of pretty important because it suggests that there may be people in your function who want to do this, but feel inhibited because they're not getting support. It's not being valued. The next thing is easy to use toolkits and checklists. And again, we are providing those. There's a toolkit in the report you can use. Training and support, which I'm going to mention, we're going to be doing that too, but also ensuring more time in project plans for collecting and using evidence. As I'll show from the qualitative data in a minute, some of our respondents argued that you really need to build this into project planning. You shouldn't see evidence-based HR as another thing you need to do. It should be part of what you're doing most of the time anyway. Also rewarding people for actually doing proper diagnosis, rewarding people for the process, and you can see some of the responses there. So people see there was a bit of an issue, they see they could be better at this, but they're also quite aware of some of the things that might help them do it, which I think is quite promising to me. So this is some of the advice from the HR professionals. These are 10 themes. I'm not going to go into them all, but I'm just going to give you examples of some of them, and they're not completely surprising, but you can see that people who've tried this and actually done it have a lot of views about the way all of us can maybe get better at doing it. So I'm just going to give some examples of some of these themes. The first and one of the most important is starting with the business issue. And Neil Morrison here from Severn Trent says, the journey we've been on started by saying, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? I think that's a really easy conversation you can have with CEOs, boards, executive teams. So let's not get on and fix something without understanding the problem, but let's start by scoping. What's the problem? What's the issue? And then saying, let's go and get the quantitative and qualitative data and evidence that helps us understand what the solutions might be to that. So this is a really crucial thing, and I'll show you the model in a minute. Starting with the business issue is core to this process. So then another one from Jackie Westerman from BBC talks about if you engage in evidence-based HR, you really have to be prepared to have your own thinking challenge. All of us have our favorite things we like to do, our favorite practices, our favorite ideas. And often an evidence-based practice shows that maybe what you want to be the case or want to be true actually isn't. And she says here, the first challenge when you're applying evidence-based HR is to expect to feel really uncomfortable and have your thinking challenged, particularly in a topic that you thought you were an expert in. It's crucial to develop the ability to be quite neutral and accept new evidence, even if it challenges your existing views. If you don't, you'll just find more evidence to convince yourself that what you've done previously is right, which isn't evidence-based thinking. It's evidence-based justification for sticking with what you're already doing. And that's a really important point. To do evidence-based HR well does require to just look at the evidence, be quite neutral, Jackie said, and sometimes say, yeah, maybe I've been getting this wrong for all these years. It doesn't actually add up. It doesn't make sense. And another theme that's coming out is leadership. And it mentioned in the survey as well, and Philippa Benet from ONS says, I think leadership from the top is really important and creating an appetite for and excitement around it in the senior leadership team, rather than just thinking, you know, it's just another thing we have to do. So just emphasize this point again. Sometimes I've noticed people say, oh God, this is another thing we have to do. No, it's the thing you should be doing anyway. It's not a new thing. It's the thing we should always be doing. And also involving the whole team, Siobhan Sheridan from the FCA says, try to avoid making evidence-based HR only about 2 or 3 people. Quite often we try to make things specialisms, but I think evidence-based HR is a capability you need to build right across your function, and capabilities require not just skills in particular individuals, they require an environment, tools, processes and systems in order to build organizational capability. So I think I'd avoid creating a EBHR unit within the function. So just to remind them, these are some of the general benefits of evidence-based HR, in case you're kind of wondering. I think the first is it decreases the ability of HR to be more effective in helping the business fundamentally. It helps us focus on business issues. It helps us mitigate risks. What are the risks associated if we do find an issue of dealing with it or not dealing with it? We can only work that out by looking carefully at the evidence and data. It allows us to prioritize. There's lots of things HR can do. Too many things we can do. How do we prioritize? How do we look at the most important business issues that HR can actually help with? It increases the value of what we do and the credibility. It reduces the waste of resources, both financial, effort and goodwill. And this is something that particularly bothers me. I think it's one of the reasons why I got interest in evidence-based HR, because it seems to me there's a lot of waste of resources in HR, time spent doing things that don't really seem to be answering any particular issue and don't seem to be really doing stuff that works particularly well. Also, it enhances our ethical standards, because as I'll talk about in a second, it's also about trying to understand what stakeholders want and believe and their perspectives as well. So that includes employees, it might include trade unions, it might include customers and clients. So it also enhances our ethical standards because looking at their perspective is a part of that evidence picture. It also helps the learning and development of the HR function. If we as functions want to get better, it seems to me we have to understand more about the evidence we've got, the evidence we need, what the business issues are and how we can help the business. And over time, this should help the whole function develop. So that was a bit about the research and the general benefits. And I want to move on to the model itself. So to remind you again, this is the definition of evidence-based HR. And these are the 3 principles: multiple sources and types of evidence information. Secondly, a structured and explicit process of gathering and using evidence. And thirdly, not focusing on all the evidence, but just the most trustworthy and relevant evidence. And I'll just mention briefly why that's so important. Sometimes when people think of using data and evidence, they gather all of it, all the stuff they can, and throw it into the mix. That's a mistake. Why? Because a lot of the data out there and a lot of the data in our organizations is simply not very reliable. So if we make decisions on biased, partial, unreliable data without thinking, what's the best quality data we've got, we won't actually make better quality decisions, we'll make possibly worse decisions. So developing the skills of understanding what is more trustworthy and reliable is crucial, so we don't throw in lots of noise and we can't see the signal. So these are just some questions people ask. Start at the top left. Do we need to apply evidence-based HR to everything we do? Some of you possibly are right now going, oh my God, this is too complicated, we can't do. No, you don't. Sometimes it's just not appropriate or just not possible. That's okay. And there's a checklist available for helping you decide this in the toolkit. So at the end of the report, there's a whole load of parts of the toolkit, which are checklists, reporting things, ways of you thinking about the process. So it's worth thinking, do we need to do evidence-based HR for this? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Do we need to follow every single part of the process? And again, the answer is no. There may be practical constraints, and I'm going to show you the process in a minute, which means you can't do that. And that's okay, because sometimes you're still going to get a better informed decision, even if you follow some of the structure, even if you can't follow all of it. Is it necessary to gather evidence from all 4 sources? And I'm going to talk about those in a minute. So no. Again, you may be only able to get evidence from 1 or 2. That's fine. That's better than 1. If you can get 3, that's better. If you can get 4, that's even better. But you don't have to. It's about making a better informed decision. Should we integrate it with our team project planning? Absolutely. There's no point in embarking on a project without building this in from the beginning. Otherwise, you'll go down the project road, you'll make all your decisions and then try and apply evidence to it. It's the kind of wrong way around. People often ask about things like top right here, experiments, innovation, cutting edge ideas. Where do they fit in? Well, I'd say, just as an example, experiments. You don't do an experiment randomly. You do it because you have good evidence and data that running an experiment will help you answer a really important question you've got. The same is true of innovation. Innovation isn't evidence-free. Innovation occurs because, again, you've used evidence and data to analyze what the problem or issue is, and you've discovered there's no actually good solutions to that, therefore you need to innovate. So this is not anti-innovation, but it leads you in some cases to experiments and innovation. And also the same with evaluation. It's crucial, it's part of this process to evaluate, but you can't evaluate at the end. You start thinking about the evaluation right at the beginning. And again, I'm quite often asked to go into organizations and evaluate interventions. So of course, the first question you ask is, well, what is the problem this was trying to resolve? And typically, there is not a very clear understanding of the problem. People want to know, does it work? And you kind of think, well, work for what? So again, interventions and evaluation of those is crucial, but it starts at the beginning of the evidence-based process, not after you've implemented something. So there's some sort of quite common questions people ask. This is the model, and I'm going to go into each part in a bit more detail. So on the left-hand side, part one, we start at the top there with an awareness of an important business issue. So we may know from the senior management team or from elsewhere, there's something going on that's important for the business. The first step, part one, is to say what is going on there. What's the issue? So 1.1, we ask answerable questions. We gather evidence. I'm going to give you some examples of the questions in a minute. We gather evidence to try and answer them. We rate how trustworthy it is. We pull it together to answer the question, what exactly is the issue? Then we reflect on that decision process and outcome. And if we have found an issue, we do the same thing in part two for what can we do about it. And you will notice that a lot of these stages are the same because essentially they are. Whether you're diagnosing or whether you're trying to think of an intervention or a solution, part of it is the same process. And at the end of that, you go to implement intervention and plan evaluation. But it always starts with the business issue, and at the bottom, you implement your intervention and you plan your evaluation of it. This is the ideal process. And I mentioned it's a guideline. You don't have to follow every single step necessarily, but it's a way of approaching business issues. So I'm going to split it up now. This is part one. I'm going to give you some examples very quickly of the kinds of questions you would ask if you were in an HR function and you're presented with a particular business issue, the kinds of questions and activities you would engage with at each stage. So before I get to that, this is just a very quick checklist. It's an example of something that's in the checklist about how to understand what isn't a business issue. So on the left-hand column, what is a business issue? It's any challenge or opportunity which has a direct and significant implication for crucial outcomes such as performance, size, or survival. In other words, it's something that's likely to affect the goals or objectives of the business. And you may want to stop and pause for a moment now to think about some of the most important things you're doing. How clear is it to you that those initiatives or practices or policies are necessarily dealing with the business issue or not? I think a clearest way to answer this is at the bottom of the left-hand column, is answer the question, if we choose to ignore this issue, how likely is it to have a negative consequence for the objectives of our business? And if the answer is it's not really, it's very likely to have negative consequences, then it probably is a business issue. If the answer is we don't know or it probably isn't, and it probably isn't a business issue you need to be concerned with. So the particular example we're going to use here is high turnover. So for example, supposing in your team you've been presented, it could come from any part of the business, from the top, from the side, somewhere else. The people are saying to you, we have a problem of high turnover. That's the presenting problem. These are the kinds of questions you would ask at each stage. So 1.1, what exactly is the presenting problem of high turnover? Why is it a problem? Where is it happening? Who is leaving? What is the turnover rate? Are the trends? How does it compare to other similar organizations? Why in general is a turnover a problem? What are the different sources of evidence, which I'll come on to in a second, what do they tell us about that? You then look across these four sources of evidence to try and answer those questions. 1.3, you look at how trustworthy or relevant it is. 1.4, you pull it together and 1.5, you say, okay, what is this presenting problem? We were told it was high turnover. What is it? Is it one problem? Is it three problems? Are there discrete problems? How serious is this problem? So even if we try to intervene and we reduce it, is it worth doing? Is it that serious a kind of problem? And then reflect on the process and outcome. So at the end of this part, you should have a better understanding of what this turnover issue is. And if there is one that's important, then you go on to the second stage. What can we do about it? And here you again answer similar questions. 2.1, given these specific turnover problems, what techniques are most likely to be effective? What are the goals of our solutions? What are the benefits and costs, risks? Are there possible unintended negative consequences? For example, again, 2.2, we look across the evidence we gathered. 2.3, rates is trustworthy. 2.4, aggregate. And then we conclude 2.5, given this evidence, what do we think is most likely to be effective in helping with this turnover problem? Is there one discrete goal? Are there multiple goals? Do we need one intervention? Do we need several interventions? And what about the risks of doing it? And again, reflect on the process. So this is just one small example. And again, quite often when people look at this, and you may, given it's the post-lunch dip, feel a bit, oh my God, this is exhausting. Well, it does require some work, but I think making better quality decisions always does, as it does in our personal life. If you're making a personal decision about moving home, about planning a complicated family holiday, whatever it is, we will tend to do this. We'll really think about what's the problem or issue, or the opportunity, what data do we have that tells us that is the case, and what's the best possible solution here. So it does take time, but again, you don't have to follow all of it. You can follow parts of it, and you certainly will never be doing this on your own. But that's kind of just an example. Now, I mentioned there's 4 sources of evidence, and top right, you have stakeholder views, perspective and concerns. Second, you have professional expertise. That's your professional expertise, your groups, but it could be external professional expertise as well. You have internal data. This is typically what you might get in people analytics, the kind of data you typically use there. And the fourth area is scientific evidence. So it could be peer-reviewed scientific publications. It could be kind of benchmarking data if it's good quality. It could be scientific evidence collected by professional bodies and others. So they're the 4 main sources of data you ideally would look across when you're trying to answer those questions. And again, you might want to reflect about in your own context, what do you typically do? What I find is people do use some evidence from stakeholders, always. They always use some evidence from inside the organization, and sometimes professional expertise of their own. But what is often missing is an explicit evaluation of the quality and relevance of all that data. It's kind of there, but we tend to use it. Again, this is just an example. So I'll pause for a minute because John said any more questions. I'm happy to take any more questions if you have any.
Anything so far? Nothing been posted, but anyone want to shout out? Right, well, we'll carry on.
Yeah, but if anything comes up, please come in. So this process model is designed to give you better answers to the question, what's the business issue? And give us better answers to the question, what can we do about it? And that's kind of it. And you may think, well, that's sort of, so what, is trivial, but this is exactly the same questions being asked across lots of professions. That yes, we always look at what the issues, we always think what we can do about it. How well do we do that? And could we do it better? I've seen your question, Sam, I'll come on to it in a minute. We don't always use evidence-based HR. We don't always have to use it. We should certainly use it for some big, important things. We don't always do every part of evidence-based HR. And this is crucial. It's all about making better informed, not perfect decisions. And if you reflect on the decisions that you and your function make, I'm guessing you wouldn't say, yes, we made that decision almost perfectly, and we could not make our decisions at all in any better way. I think that's unlikely. And if you think that's important because you want to be more effective and help the business, then something like evidence-based HR will help you to do that. Now, Sam has a question. How do you get access to scientific publications, get over the paywall, and how do you know which research is good? Fantastic question. So there's a couple of things. One is there is the stuff that CRF produces. which is, I would say, of good quality, and when we review the scientific evidence, review it fairly carefully. And getting over the paywall, that's problematic. It sounds like, Sam, you've actually tried to do this, but there are ways around it. There's things like ResearchGate, and there is more and more stuff being put online. CIPD and the Centre for Evidence-Based Management also do reviews of scientific evidence around HR topics, and there's more of this happening, but I think implicit in your question, Sam, is that it's quite hard to find. And how do you know which research is good? That is a very important question, and I think you need some understanding, certainly where it's published, who wrote it, the university they work for are not good indicators. Generally speaking, you judge the quality of the evidence by the question it's trying to answer, and if the design is capable and appropriate for actually answering that question. But yes, there is a lot of stuff out there, and it is sometimes quite hard to work out what's higher and lower quality. Lizzie says, my director always says it's okay to decide to do nothing as long as that's a decision we made, not just in that habit. Well, exactly, Lizzie, yeah. So I think that's a really important point. So your director sounds quite enlightened, but doing nothing is often the absolutely best thing to do. But again, you can only decide that on the basis of saying, what's the issue, what's going on, and what can we do about it? And sometimes the answer is, well, don't do anything because it's okay, or it's going to make it worse. Similarly, I think, and we're developing this as well with our audit tool, is sometimes people also say it's okay just to stop doing things. Sometimes it's really important to stop doing stuff, but again, on the basis of looking at the evidence. And if you look to the evidence and you can't work out what that policy or practice is supposed to be doing, you can't even see there is a problem it's trying to fix, then you shouldn't do it. And again, I think it's quite hard to stop doing things sometimes in professional context, but yeah, doing nothing and stopping stuff is often more important in some context than what you actually do. Thank you, Lizzie. Right, so something about the model. It's a guideline, it's a framework, it's not a recipe, it's not a strict thing you have to follow. It's helping you be more effective in terms of helping the business. That's what it's for. Right, I'm just going to kind of draw things together by talking about some of the next steps that you can take and that we want to take with you as well, which is, just to summarize now, I think there's a widespread acceptance the profession needs to make better use of evidence to improve our effectiveness and our value to the business. The case studies and the survey and the practical advice from HR colleagues show to some extent how this can be done. There's really solid advice in there about what you can do. The evidence-based HR process model and the toolkit are designed to help us make better use of evidence, and every HR function has plenty of opportunity to do more. So part of the rationale for the report and this event today and the model and the toolkit is to do three things. One is to make us want to get better at evidence-based HR. The second, it's to make us feel we understand it enough to get better at it. And the third thing is it's to enable us to see there are opportunities for us to do evidence-based HR. So they're the three most important things, I guess, we want you to take away from the report. So the next step, so the meeting notes from the in-person event are now available. We're going to be launching an online training course this spring in evidence-based HR. I'm available specifically for any follow-on consulting or training. And also I'm going to show you it in a second. We have an evidence-based HR audit tool, which is going to be again launching this spring. So we're trying to put together both in the report and after the report, a range of resources, tools, techniques to help you actually do it. So I'm going to talk about the audit tool in a second, but just notice a couple of questions. I'm going to just read these as I try and expand my tiny screen. Okay, Kaya says, my organisation has made great progress in moving towards evidence-based. So now I lost the more evidence-based approach. Where we are getting stuck is bringing the business challenge and evidence along on the journey, continuously checking against our progress towards solving the issue. What advice would you give? Right, I don't know exactly the...
Do you want to expand a little bit on that, Kaya? But
yeah,
just to bring that to life for us. Sorry to put you on the spot, but tell us a bit more about what the problem is, and we'll get Rob's response. Great, thank you. I think we're losing, certainly at this end, I'm not getting that. We're losing the signal, so.
Well, I'll try and answer it how I think it, what you may mean. So is bringing the business challenge and evidence along the journey. And I don't know quite what that means, but I know that some of the case studies we also have in the report show that if you're going to do this, because it's quite a systematic and structured way of using evidence to help you identify the issue and think about a solution, recording the evidence is incredibly important. So if you see it as a series of steps or journey, as you put it, then keeping that data and evidence with you along the way is very important. One way of doing that is to actually write it down. In one of the case studies, they describe how they had basically a template in which they kept bits of evidence and information. So they were constantly looking at them. Is someone trying to come in there? Person also is asked about KPIs. Yeah, but I mean, again, this is not fair to blame LinkedIn for being terrible, but there are some absolutely terrible HR KPI lists on LinkedIn, for example. Things like percentage of employees trained, speed to hire. These are really good examples of completely non-evidence-based KPIs. If you're going to present them as general things, because speed to hire or obviously just training people is pointless. How is that going to help the business? So I think KPIs are really good if they're evidence-based KPIs. So in other words, they really are about the P, their performance. So you know how the things you're measuring of what you're doing in HR actually are an effective solution to a well-diagnosed business problem. Then they're real KPIs. What I see is what very generic KPIs, which I think are not terribly helpful. And Wendy's given us a reminder here of journal access to COPD. Yes, that's a very good point. Thanks, Wendy. And Lizzie also mentions the same point about COPD access. Okay, and Calandra here says, how do you know when you have enough evidence? Yes, it can. And this is a fantastic question, one I often get asked. So you've all heard of the expression analysis paralysis. Well, I've never seen it. What I've seen is people who don't want to make a decision. And they put off making the decision by saying, oh, I just need to get more evidence. With this process, it's about making a better informed decision. You can say now, next Wednesday at 12 o'clock, we're going to make a decision. Whatever evidence we've got, we're going to be aware of the evidence we've got. We're going to be aware of its quality. We're going to be aware of where the gaps are. We're going to make a decision at that point. We will take action. You don't have to let the evidence put you off. So I think it's a very good point, and that is an anxiety people have about it. You can literally just draw a line and say, we're going to stop, and that's enough, and now we're going to act. Because you still would have made a better informed decision than not doing that, if that makes sense. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
We had a good example, Rob, didn't we, in our event the other day from Thales, wasn't it, who said, you know, that very defined periods, kind of in the agile sprint methodology.
Yes.
During this period, we'll be collecting evidence, analysing evidence, and we're going to move to our next phase, which I thought was quite a
thanks, John. Yeah, that was really, yes. And read the report. Really, I forgot about that. It's a really good case because they just did it very, very fast, but they did it in a very structured way. Yeah, use the idea of Scrum or Sprint or those kinds of ideas. They did it very fast because they wanted to do it quickly. They didn't waste or spend a lot of resource doing it. They just wanted to get a better answer to understanding the issue they had and what they could do about it. And again, they're pretty convinced that that really helped them get a better answer to that, even though it wasn't that time consuming or took that long. Yeah, thanks, John. So this is the audit tool that I mentioned we're doing. So there's two main things it's for. One is to think about teams. So if you think about you and your function, and you think about some of the behaviors that are involved in being an evidence-based HR practitioner, you can start to ask people, how often does your team, does your function do these things? What percentage of the time? And what that allows you to do is to see a gap. So obviously the point is not to get to 100%. The point is to sort of see where you can improve and get better at doing some of those things. So you can see both your individual perceptions of that, and then you can look across the whole team and see what the collective or consensus view is about that and why there might be differences in perception. And then you can work on trying to get better at improving some of those behaviors. For example, one of those behaviors might be something like, Liz, great question, I'm going to come on to that in a second. One of those things might be, for example, not being very good at thinking about the quality of data. You may say, yeah, we do use evidence, we do use data, but you know what? We never explicitly ask ourselves, how reliable and trustworthy is this? So you can see, yeah, that's something we need to get better at doing, because we don't want to throw in lots of evidence and data that doesn't work. Okay, Liz, yes, this is a great question, to which the answer is, you don't need evidence. And that might sound very, very odd in the context of a webinar about evidence-based HR. And the reason you don't is this: it's fundamentally, I guess, logical that using data and evidence is more likely to get you what you want than if you don't. So if I want to go and catch a train from London Bridge, near I am now, to go to Brighton, and I really don't want to wait, hang around on the station, am I more or less likely, even given the unreliabilities of trains, to minimize my waiting time if I actually look at data and evidence in the timetable, particularly if it's live? Yeah, I'm more likely to. If I am booking a holiday and I want it to be warm, am I more or less likely to get a warm holiday if I look at historical data about temperature from that location? I'm more likely. Now, you might say, Liz, well, you need to do randomized control of that. I could do that, but I would say on the whole, I think making more informed decisions is more likely to get the outcomes you want. But I appreciate your question, and this is one I've been asked quite a lot. And I think it's better to get, in a way, rather than thinking, does it work, more thinking, well, why wouldn't it? But I appreciate it, yeah. And John said, if you don't like the cost of education, try ignorance. Quite, yeah. And while we're on quotes, that possibly you may be familiar with the quote that Einstein apparently said, but apparently also definitely didn't say. He said something like, if you had an hour to save the world, he'd spend the first 55 minutes diagnosing the problem and the next 5 minutes deciding on a solution, implementing it. And so I think that's what people, again, another question a bit like Liz's, people often say, what's the one thing we could do to make better informed decisions? It'd be spend a lot more time understanding the problem. And that's tricky, and people find it difficult because it's quite confusing. It's cognitively quite difficult. Thinking about solutions and implementing them is in a way cognitively a bit easier, and it's more fun. And Liz says, is it more about the balance of time and effort to get to? Yes, it is, Liz. Yes, absolutely. So if it's probably a small issue that isn't that important to the organization, it would not be, as you're saying, Liz, worth spending loads and loads and loads of time trying to get all the evidence. It just wouldn't be, as a cost benefit, it's not worth it. If it's a really important issue to the business, even kind of a survival issue, then it really is worth spending the time. So yes, there's another way of putting it, Liz. Thanks. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Wendy's put, can you help us all join the dots in our heads? That sounds a bit painful, Wendy, but I'll try and join the dots in your heads between EBHR and HR good practice or best practice project. Okay. So I would say, I don't know what good practice means. It seems to me best practice is almost the antithesis of evidence-based HR, because we don't know. We don't know what's best practice until we have data from all those other sources. So typically when people talk about good practice or best practice, yes, they've got evidence or data, but often it's only from one of those sources. Like it might be just a scientific evidence, or perhaps just, for example, case studies, other kinds of things. Yes, it's certainly good to look at it, but in a way, I think best practice and good practice leads to solutioneering, where we see a solution or a practice, and then we try and desperately fit the issue to fit that thing we see and we think looks good. It may turn out that the best intervention turns out to be listed on a best practice list, fine, but you shouldn't start from there. You should start from what the issues are, that makes sense. And yeah. So just going to talk about the audit tool. So the first bit of it is about where you are in your team, but keep the questions coming. They're great. Thank you. And also where your main initiatives are in relation to it. So you can look at your behavior, how evidence-based it is, in a sense, as a team. You can also look at your main HR initiatives. So for example, let's take, I'm sure most of the people in this webinar are doing things around D&I. What would happen if you looked at all those policies and practices you're implementing around D&I and you put them an evidence-based HR lens on them? You firstly say, what are our D&I issues, problems, opportunities, whatever they might be? What are our practices around this? And why do we think those practices are likely to solve these problems? And how well do we even understand those problems? So what it would allow you to do is look across lots of your main initiatives and basically crudely say, this initiative kind of does make sense because we're looking back on it. We did have fairly good evidence about the issue, and we did have fairly good evidence that this initiative was likely to solve it. Others will be, we don't really know, so we need to go back and investigate. Other initiatives, once you put them through an evidence-based HR lens that I mentioned before, might be exactly those where we say, actually, why are we doing this? We should probably stop doing it because we're not sure what the issue is. And whatever it is, this thing we're doing doesn't seem to work. So the audit has these two parts to it. One is the behaviors and one is the stuff you've done or doing. And also we're trying to set up an audit community practice user group to do it. So Nicholas come in and says, should this be based hand in hand with some process improvement? It could be. I would have to, it could be if it's a process improvement issue, absolutely. So people quite often talk about in relation to things like agile, things like lean, say, isn't it the same thing? No, it's not the same thing, but it has similarities. So there's no reason why there may be, in the evidence-based HR process, there may be parts of it that you think could be done quite well by bringing in another method as well. The same might be said of some people analytics stuff. You know, people analytics is incredibly useful for some things in some context, and you should bring it in as part of that whole kind of evidence picture. So this is an example of some of the kinds of measures that will be in the audit. This is about behaviors. So let's look at number one. And again, you would answer this individually and then compare scores. What percentage of the time are your team's key activities, you have to agree about what those were, focused on resolving a specific business issue, as opposed to engaging activities that are not directly focused on a business issue? You could say, well, we never do that, or we always do that, or 30% of the time we do it. Question two, what percentage of the time does your team ask questions and gather evidence to first clearly identify the problem or issue before considering a possible solution? And again, you'd give a judgment to how often you do that. So at the end of it, you get a profile, which you complete individually, then you get a consensus score for how much you're engaging in evidence-based HR behaviors, where the gaps are, and also some suggestions about what we can do about that. The second part of it is around initiatives. So the decision to implement initiative X, it could be some talent management program, was based on resolving a specific business issue. How accurate is it when you look at that talent management program that it really was based on resolving a specific business issue? And also question two, before implementing this initiative, a talent management program, we had a reasonable quantity of good quality evidence from multiple sources of the precise nature of that talent management program. Again, you can ask the same questions about why you chose a talent management and that particular talent management thing. So again, you come out of this, maybe you might have your top 10 initiatives in HR, the top 10 priorities, things you're doing, and you could go through each one and get a sense of where do all these lie on a scale of probably that does not seem to be very evidence-based at all. So that actually does seem fairly sound. Where they lie, and then what do you do for the ones where you're not too sure if it is particularly evidence-based? Because if you're not too sure, it massively reduces the chances that that is actually helping the business, and also massively reduces your effectiveness as a function. So the next steps are just to try it. The best way, of course, as we all know, is to learn by doing with the support of the model, the toolkit, and CRF. I mentioned also I can come and help. You can come and help with the audit. We can train, and you can talk to Mel about how else we can support you. And finally, think about the alternatives. If you're not doing evidence-based HR, what sort of HR are you doing? And these are some alternatives to evidence-based HR. So eminence-based HR is where we take the views of the most senior and experienced members, also called HIPPO decision-making. Vehemence-based HR, where those people who express their opinions with the greatest volume, you use that as a guide. Eloquence-based HR is whatever the smooth talkers and those with the gift of the gab say that take the precedence. Obedience-based HR, simply doing what you're told to do. When HR colleagues and business partners just become order takers from senior management. Resemblance-based HR, just copying what other people are doing, unthinking, which again, can be one of the problems with best practice. Defense-based HR, just doing whatever's the safest option, doing the thing that's least likely to get us into trouble. Indolence-based HR, think about how difficult each thing is going to be, and then just choose whichever course of action is easiest. Haste-based HR, time is the most important thing. Whatever you can do quickly is the thing you're going to do. Or indulgence-based HR, choosing to do whatever we think we're likely to enjoy doing most. And finally, reverence-based HR, looking around for whatever you feel is the coolest or most amazing or truly awesome thing, and then just doing it. There are alternatives to evidence-based HR, but I don't think they are particularly attractive, but I certainly recognize a lot of these. You probably do as well. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn to the questions. So Liz says, Kirsten, what evidence do you need on these to explain your races? What evidence do you need?
This was from the audit tool, those ratings. How do you get evidence to support how you've rated yourself, I think?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Right. Okay. So I think in the case of your own behavior, I think you have to think about, you'd have to probably ideally list the key activities you're sort of functional working on. You'd have to think about, how do we go, again, it might be difficult to remember, but go back to the decision you made and actually just think in each case. I'll go back to the slide. So let's take number 2. You think about these key activities, and maybe whatever, 10 of them. You may think, for each of these, did we really gather evidence to first clearly identify a problem or issue before we thought about the solution? And simply say, yeah, did we, what percent of the time did we do it? So you definitely look at your own memory of it. There may be documentation you could use. There may be other sources of evidence you could use to try and draw on to give that judgment. And again, then another way of doing it, of course, is to, when you discuss it in your team, to get a consensus view about where do you think you lie on it. So, and in terms of this, it's probably, again, going back to particular initiatives and actually going back over the story of how you made that decision to get to that initiative. And you may have done analysis at the time. There may be meeting notes, there may be agendas, there may be other kinds of data you can use to help you make that judgment. So yeah, thanks for that. Liz says, based on evidence you have so far, which common HR practices to do deliver, which are a waste of time? Okay, again, great question, thank you. The real challenge here is that it's possible, let's go to extremes. I think there's some practices that probably most of the time are a waste of time. And there's other practices that most of the time in most contexts probably help a bit or to some extent. And there's a big chunk in the middle of it depends. So for example, on this end that probably help most of the time, I think going back to old job design theory, clarifying for people what the expectations are of their role and what you expect them to deliver, for example, and giving them resources to do it, probably in most contexts will deliver better performance. I think on this end, and this is a common example everyone always uses, but just annual performance appraisals, where you don't really know why you're doing it, you don't have good measures of performance, and every manager and every appraisee just sees the whole thing as a pain and goes through it in a very ritualistic way and says things like, we've got to get this back to HR by the end of the month, let's just do it. Probably they aren't very useful. But you can also identify on this end practices. I'll give you an example where there's maybe quite good scientific evidence. One example is unconscious bias training. So that has been very popular. I think it's less popular now as part of DEI initiatives, but it's pretty clear from the scientific evidence, and there's now a reasonable quantity of good quality evidence. It's fairly clear that it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. So you could say over there, that it's very unlikely to actually help, for example, reduce unconscious bias or change behavior, because the scientific evidence suggests it can't. Other people say it's impossible for it to do it anyway. So I think you can't, so there's a lot of it depends in the middle, where you need to get evidence from loads of sources to know whether that practice will deliver. And at extremes, there are a few that, yeah, probably this isn't good. Yeah, probably this most of the time is effective, if that makes sense.
Rob, I think we're about there with our time. So thank you for that. Big thank. I've applied an evidence-based approach to evaluating how well we've done. And I calculated that we retain 90% of our audience for 90% of the time. So I thought that was pretty good. We always get a little drop off in the last few minutes as people go off to the next meeting. So well done for that. I wanted to just say thanks as well to our partners in this research. We did have contributions from Bird & Bird, the legal firm, and Mindthriven, who do AI-based change, have a change tool based on AI. And you can see their contribution at the start of the report. They've written a kind of forward to the report. So look out for the further resources that Rob's mentioned along the way, tools and the training and the follow-up. Follow us and follow Rob on LinkedIn, and you'll see us post on this subject further, and it'll just attract you towards those resources. And other than that, thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.